Welcome. This is Craig Applegath, and this is the 21st Century Imperative Podcast, the podcast series that explores the insights and approaches of scientists, designers, planners, engineers, business entrepreneurs, and other successful change makers who are finding effective ways to meet the three critical challenges posed by the 21st Century Imperative. These are: how will we continue to live on our planet without destroying our biosphere? How will we repair and regenerate the environmental damage we have already caused? And how will we adapt to the escalating impacts of climate change? Each episode will feature an interview with an individual whom I think you will find not only inspiring, but also very relevant, helping you answer the question, what can I do to meet the challenges of the 21st Century Imperative? In this episode, I'll be interviewing Ryan Meyers, one of the world's leaders in quantifying natural capital and most recently the Chief Technology Officer at Impact Infrastructure. I've had the great pleasure of working with Ryan on a number of projects, including a series of workshops to help define the concept of regenerative symbiotic cities, and more recently on how to deploy the AutoCase software on a couple of university campus master plans. Ryan is one of the brightest young entrepreneurs I know. He combines his background in biology, business management, and computer science to design sophisticated software solutions to solve critically important environmental problems. He is also one heck of a nice guy. As a co-founder of Impact Infrastructure, Ryan developed the analytical engine for the company's original product, AutoCase for Sites, and ultimately led the development teams for both of Impact's products, AutoCase for Buildings and AutoCase for Sites. Ryan is now working as a software and sustainability consultant with the goal of changing how decisions are made through the use of objective research-based methodologies to monetize sustainability. In today's interview, we're going to talk about why the monetization of natural capital is so important in finding a pathway towards minimizing the risks of climate change, and how we can all be contributing to the effort. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Thanks so much for making the time to do this podcast interview today, Ryan. You're doing some very interesting and exciting work in the quantification and valuation of natural capital and sustainability, so I've really been looking forward to the conversation today. So why don't I provide a bit of background to introduce you to our listeners. You grew up in Canada, but you have lived for periods in Great Britain, the United States, and Barbados. You trained as a biologist at Queen's University, then spent a couple of years successfully competing as a member of Canada's rowing team. Then you got your MBA at Dalhousie University in order to provide you with some key entrepreneurial skills. So why don't you start off by talking about when your interest in sustainability emerged and how it grew to be your animating purpose?
Okay. So first of all, thanks so much for having me today. I've really been looking forward to this podcast and interview. I think I've always been interested in the environment and sustainability. When I was an undergrad, I studied biology, as you just mentioned. And near the end of undergrad, I knew that I either wanted to go into healthcare or sustainability. And my reason for that was I wanted to spend my career doing something that had meaning, doing something where I felt like I was either helping the planet or other people. So I ended up landing on sustainability because it just seemed to me that it was kind of this rapidly growing area where it was a huge buzzword, but it still seemed relatively new. So I ended up looking into different career paths for sustainability. And of course, as most people are in undergrad, I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do. I ended up finding this company called Jakes Whitford, which was a sustainability consulting firm out of Burlington. And I thought that would be really cool to work for a company in sustainability consulting. What ended up happening was after I left the rowing team and I was applying for MBA programs, I discovered that Jakes Whitford had been actually acquired by a company called Stantec, and one of the MBA programs that I was applying to at Dalhousie, which also had an 8-month corporate residency or work term as part of the program, was partnered with Stantec. And their primary contact from Stantec was this guy named Marty Janowitz, who used to be the vice president of Jakes Whitford. So anyway, long story short, that's why I ended up choosing the MBA program, and I ended up working for Marty at Stantec in the sustainability group, and that's kind of how I got into the space.
The word sustainability covers a lot of ground. What is it about sustainability that attracts your interest or your concern? Like you said you wanted to do something that actually benefited humanity, and you were looking at medicine versus sustainability. So what is it at least back then, as far as you remember, and of course, memories are not always perfect, but what was it about sustainability that captured your interest?
Well, I was pretty interested in both health and sustainability, but I can say the main reason that I chose sustainability actually was because I felt that I would be able to have the greater impact in the realm of sustainability. So to be honest, I kind of thought healthcare, although I could create positive impact for a lot of people, I thought it would be really hard to change anything in the healthcare sector. Whereas in sustainability, because it's so much more, well, at least at the time, I thought it was so much more market driven and private sector oriented. I thought, well, the possibilities were endless as far as I could tell. So I thought that I could have a greater impact, actually change things if I went into sustainability.
Training in biology, great background for that. And then MBA to provide you with some good entrepreneurial skills and understanding the context of the private sector. So how did you end up developing software applications to make real estate and infrastructure sector more sustainable?
Yeah, totally niche and random.
Yeah, but looking forward to big data and AI, very, very important. But where did that sort of connection point come?
By the middle of 2012, I can say that I had two real passions or interests, and they were sustainability and finance. And so part of me really wanted to go into the realm of sustainability and just do that on a full-time basis. And the other part of me was like, God, finance is really cool. Like this whole realm that I've just come to learn in this MBA. And I was pursuing my CFA then, passed my level 1 CFA exam that year. And I was like, maybe I should go into like banking or something just because I love numbers and I love finance. So while I was at Stantec in the sustainability group, I was taking part in all these webinars. And I remember this one webinar I took part in, and it was oriented towards sustainability professionals from organizations all across the United States and Canada. And I remember the presenter of the webinar saying, now, and there were like 100 people from all these organizations, sustainability professionals. And he goes, now, it may feel like the decision maker at your organization isn't listening to what you're suggesting the company should be doing, be it the CEO or CFO or whatever, but don't give up. Keep pushing, because it might not be tomorrow, it might not be next week, might not be next month, but someday they're going to understand the value in these initiatives that you're trying to get the company to do, and they're going to implement them, and the company's going to be better off as a result of it. And I was like, wow, that's the advice in 2012 in the realm of sustainability, is just don't give up, keep pushing. Like there seems to be this fundamental disconnect between the value that sustainability professionals know that sustainability can bring to an organization in real tangible ways, and what decision makers need in order to make those investments. So, a sustainability professional would go up to the CEO or decision maker and say, I think we should invest, X number of millions of dollars to get this building LEED certified, or we should invest, $1 million for this other initiative that's going to provide all these benefits for employee productivity and stuff like that. And the decision maker would say, okay, well, if I invest $1 million in that, what's the return on investment going to be? And I think a lot of sustainability professionals say, oh, well, it's going to be really high. A lot of the benefits are intangible. You're going to have increased productivity. You're going to have reduced absenteeism, reduced attrition rates. Customers like to buy from companies that are more sustainability oriented, so our revenues might go up. There's all kinds of huge benefits. And they'd say, okay, well, that sounds great, but what's the actual ROI on that $1 million going to be?
Can you quantify it?
Can you quantify it? And most the vast majority of sustainability professionals can't do that. And so that's kind of how I slipped into the space. Was I ended up taking on this project at Stantec to build a tool that the company could use to put a dollar value on the returns from corporate investments they were making in the realm of sustainability.
And that's what evolved into the AutoK software.
That's kind of where it started for me. And I should say I actually was hugely inspired by an author named Bob Willard, who's actually from the Greater Toronto area, who wrote a series of books, but the one that I read that got me started was called The New Sustainability Advantage. And it was all about quantifying the ROI of sustainability for organizations and how it affects the bottom line. Forget everything else, just how it affects the bottom line. And so I actually used his spreadsheets with his permission as the foundation for the first tools I made. And then I kind of evolved out of that. And through my supervisor at the time, Marty, I was put in touch with two co-founders at a company called Impact Infrastructure, which is where I was for a few years following Stantec. And Impact Infrastructure is a company that produces the tool that you just mentioned called AutoCase. And that's all that they do is put a dollar value on sustainability. But their focus is not on corporate investments. Their focus is on working out the ROI of green design and low impact development.
Yes, I know, and we'd had conversations about that when we were working with you on implementing it, because one of my greatest difficulties in dealing with projects that are going to be very green is, as you said, convincing clients that it has more than brand value, that there's actually some monetary value that can be attached to it, and quantifying it so they can take it to their board and say, we're going to add this extra $1 million of construction cost to this project because here is the return. And I think that's such a key thing. So what have you been developing recently that helps move you in the direction of increasing the ability for projects and systems to be more sustainable?
So there's the two AutoCase products that I developed with Impact Infrastructure. One focused on sites and green infrastructure. So in other words, things like porous asphalt and retention basins and infiltration trenches, and looking at how they manage stormwater and reduce carbon emissions and all that kind of stuff. And the second product there was focused on buildings. So that was looking at the benefits of getting a LEED certification for a building and the return on investment from that, and the returns from just implementing other green design elements for buildings. Other things I've been working on are, for the city of Toronto, I built a carbon calculator. So that was more oriented towards the residents of Toronto, where they could go to the website and they could put in their miles driven per month and how much they were cycling and how much they were taking transit and how many flights they were taking and all that kind of stuff. And it would work out their estimated carbon footprint. And most recently, I've actually been talking with, it's kind of coming full circle, talking with Bob Willard again about potentially putting together a software version of the spreadsheets that he developed and that I started with years ago for use by sustainability professionals at corporations.
Right. As a biologist, an MBA, and now digital technology and programming expert, you are in a very unique position to understand how we might make our economy more sustainable to help us meet the challenges of the 21st century imperative. So what are some of the key takeaways from your software development experience that you think might be able to be applied to helping us move forward in dealing with the challenges posed by climate change?
There were a lot of interesting takeaways that I had building AutoCase or being a part of building AutoCase. One of the main ones is that, like many of the people listening to this podcast, there are definitely people who care, who really want to make decisions that are going to benefit the environment. But the vast majority of decision makers have to answer the question, what's in it for me? Or what's in it for the investors in this project? And so I think one of the main takeaways that I had is that we really need to reframe the conversation of climate change and making more sustainable decisions around answering that question, what's in it for me? And I would say that that's what the last 6 years or so of my life have totally been about, is putting a dollar value to this stuff, but then figuring out how to then divide that up amongst stakeholder groups to communicate that message in a way that fully answers that question for each group. One of the things that I've also been learning a lot about is product development and the need to build products that customers really need that can either make their lives easier or produce more value for them or produce more value for their clients. And so one of the, I guess, high-level ideas that I've thought about in terms of product development is to use a strategy that we've called at Impact Infrastructure, the Trojan horse strategy. So what we need to do is start bringing climate change into the decision-making process on a much more regular basis. And so when I say Trojan horse strategy, what I mean is let's create products that deliver people real value, that help them with their job or help them create more value or whatever. But let's also start sprinkling in elements of climate change oriented information. So for example, with our products, we were talking about maybe making a life cycle assessment tool that could really easily do a quantity takeoff, or basically look at all the different materials that you need to build something in a design environment, give you cost estimates and life cycle cost estimates for those design elements, but then also talk about, say, the climate change impact or the carbon footprint impact. So we can start bringing that stuff into the conversation. So anyway, that's a bit of a long-winded answer, but I think what I'm trying to say is I think it's about answering that question, what's in it for me, and bringing information about climate change and sustainability into the decision-making process on a more regular basis.
So making climate change into something that can answer the question, or addressing it in a way that can answer the question, what's in it for me? How do you overcome the classic problem of hyperbolic discounting? The idea that as human beings look into the future, they tend to discount the importance of things happening in the future versus right now. And that's one of the big problems with us dealing with climate change, is because people see it as not necessarily something they don't believe in, but just something that's going to happen so far down the road that it's not important to deal with now.
Yeah, that's a challenge. But I would say two things. One is, when Obama was in office last year, he started changing the way that he was talking about climate change, from saying, we need to address this so blah, blah, doesn't happen in the future, to this is happening now. And there are a lot of negative impacts of climate change that we're already seeing.
Right.
So I think the first thing is just...
It's very clearly starting to bite.
Yeah, highlighting what's happening now. But I think that discounting issue is a huge problem. And this is something I was actually going to bring up a little later on, but something I was thinking about was, for the government, we often hear when prime minister is running or the president's running, we hear them talk a lot about balanced budgets and the need to reduce our deficit and reduce our federal debt. And the voter base, I think, kind of, it ebbs and flows how much they care about that. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of people do care about the deficit. In my mind, it's kind of the same thing. Like, people care about the deficit because they don't want to put ourselves in a bad position
in the future.
This is exactly the same thing. Last year, actually, the 2014, 15, and 16 U.S. federal deficits were $485, $438, and $587 billion. And the U.S. over the last few years has emitted about 5 million kilotons of carbon dioxide per year. So in 2015, it was actually like 5.1 million kilotons. Or in other words, 5 billion tons of carbon dioxide. So I think that we should be including the carbon that we're emitting in the atmosphere in the conversation about our deficits. So 5 billion kilotons of carbon dioxide at about $100 per ton is a $500 billion climate deficit that we're putting in each year. So again, the US deficits were an average of about $500 billion per year in the last 3 years. But also in the last 3 years, the social value of carbon dioxide emitted just by the United States alone was $500 billion. So in other words, if you incorporate that, you're literally doubling the deficit that we face in future years. I think that we
not to mention the debt.
Not
right.
to mention
Yeah,
that.
That's
yeah,
right.
Exactly.
I mean, it has the same implications. And,
right.
and actually, that's a very smart strategy, because it's become very much embedded in our economic discussions and culture discussions, for that matter. The notion of deficit, and depending on what side of the right or left you're on, it has different implications. But it's such an understood concept to link it to have carbon having a financial implication will bring it home. It attaches it to a very, very powerful idea embedded in everyone's head.
Yeah. So another thing that I learned in software development, which is related to what we're talking about, is the importance of simplifying things. So simplify the UI, the user interface, as much as possible. Simplify the outputs, simplify the inputs, simplify everything as much as possible. And I think that that applies to this as well, because climate change at the end of the day is an extremely complex problem. There are so many systems that are intertwined and influencing this issue that it even creates problems for the best scientists and the best climate models to project what's going to happen. So it's an extremely complex problem.
It's a super wicked problem.
Yeah.
Right? In the classic definition.
Right, exactly. But what we really need is buy-in from the majority of the public that this is a real problem, so that governments and organizations can start moving in the right direction. But to get buy-in, everybody has to understand the problem. And so I think taking these complicated ideas and attaching them to concepts that people already understand, or framing them in ways that are really easy to understand, I think is super important. So that's why I'm thinking framing it in the context of US deficits and overall debt, or Canadian deficits and debt, is one way to help understanding. There's another thing. So there was this article released last month called A Roadmap for Rapid Decarbonization.
Right.
Did you see that?
Yes. Yeah. It's
So,
brilliant.
Yeah, really well done.
We'll capture that in the notes with a link.
Okay. Yeah. So it's really well done, partly because it links targets for carbon reduction to, first of all, a relatively simple concept, but also one that's widely understood, which is Moore's Law. So Moore's Law was all about computer capacity, basically, and that processor speeds would double every, 2 to 3 years? And they did. Until recently, it started to level off a little bit. But the scientists in this article linked climate change targets to the same concept, saying we need to have a carbon law. Where we essentially, starting in the year 2020, we need to reduce carbon emissions by 50% every decade for the next 3 decades. And I think that that's a great way to frame the solution, because I think a lot of the time, when we talk in gigatons of carbon dioxide, it just becomes this abstract concept that people have trouble wrapping their heads around. But this is a concept that on an international, national, state or provincial or municipal level can be implemented. Okay, that's the target. We need to reduce our emissions from 36 on an international scale, 36 gigatons of carbon dioxide to about 20 by the year 2030. Okay, that's a target.
And I think we're seeing now that, given that there are tools for reductions, for example, renewable energies, and renewable energies like photovoltaics are now below net parity. In other words, the cost of making energy by burning coal, that there's certainly an economic rationale for doing it. Mm-hmm. And if you look at what is happening in Ontario and some of the other provinces in California where there are cap and trade requirements, you can see the effect it's having on institutions. They are now starting to plan for carbon. They have to. They've been forced to look at their carbon regime over time. Every single one of my institutional clients is now looking at how to do a carbon roadmap. Mm-hmm. And before that, no one was. Yes, everyone thought it was important, but it wasn't something they were going to have to do. Mm-hmm. What do you think are some of the key limitations to a market-driven social change method?
The main problem is that it'll only work where the case can be made. So thankfully, there are more and more instances where technology is reaching a point where you can make the business case, but there are still a lot of instances where you can't. And I think that's where governments and subsidies and regulation need to step in. The whole point of subsidies and regulation is to make something cost effective when everyone agrees that there's a social value or economic benefit to it. This is the perfect scenario for that. I also think that even in the private sector, or maybe this is somewhere where the government needs to step in as well, there needs to be a better definition of what the social cost of carbon is. That's kind of universally agreed upon and then applied across different areas. So in the example I just gave for the carbon dioxide deficit in the United States being $500 billion, that example was contingent on a social cost of carbon of $100 per ton, but that varies pretty widely depending on who you're speaking to. So I've seen numbers as low as $14 a ton and as high as $400 a ton.
Depending on what social costs you're accounting for.
Depending on, exactly. So I think that's the first thing. But I think that there are other areas where there's a lot of capacity for the private sector to drive more change faster. And we're not taking advantage of that to the degree that we could be yet. And it might be, well, I'll give an example. The example I'm thinking of is in the realm of green bonds. So green bonds is a rapidly growing asset class. It's grown from about $11 billion in 2013 to $42 billion, about 4 times the size, just 2 years later in 2015. And then in 2016, I didn't see final numbers, but it was projected to be about $100 billion asset class. And that was just for issuances in 2016. But one of the things that we were thinking about at Impact Infrastructure was, how do you even define a green bond? So a green bond is a debt instrument that can be put towards quote unquote green companies or green investments. But how do we define green? It's this very wishy-washy thing, and it shouldn't be like that. We should have quantified metrics to define what a green asset is. For example, for each dollar invested, there must be at least a 10-cent return in terms of social capital or environmental capital. So I think that's the first thing, is there is all of this pent-up demand to invest in sustainability, but we could be doing a better job of, one, defining what that is, and two, making a better business case to invest in that. So if there was a social cost of carbon or cap and trade or carbon tax or whatever implemented, all of a sudden those green investments become worth a whole lot more.
Right.
And you start incentivizing the private sector and investors to actually pour more money into it because they're going to get more on the bottom line.
Right. And the software you were developing previously was very much about providing the valuation technique to actually account for that.
That's exactly where we were going. We thought, well, if we can standardize the methodologies to put a dollar value on this stuff, then we could apply it to some sort of an exchange, like an equity exchange or an infrastructure exchange or something like that, where investors can actually see the environmental returns and ultimately potentially even their returns if there's a carbon financial incentive there in dollar terms.
Your involvement in programming and data processing for developing your software previously has probably given you some key insights into machine learning, big data, and the future of artificial intelligence. What roles do you think these things might play in our ability to cope with climate change? I mean, that's a really open-ended question, but there's some really exciting things happening in those areas. Are you seeing any opportunities there that immediately strike you as being possibly productive?
Machine learning, I think, has already been applied quite a lot in the realm of climate change, like the IPCC climate models, for example. Those are massive statistical models that have huge underlying algorithms that are looking at the complexity of how everything is interacting around the planet. That is an example of machine learning. I think the main benefits of machine learning that I see in the near term are around optimization. So machine learning can be used in the context of things like urban planning and generative design. So that's something that we've talked about.
Computational design.
Like, how do you actually design a building for optimal outcomes? Like, maybe you want to design a building that's going to maximize your views to the waterfront and minimize the carbon footprint, and it must be at least 40 stories and have this much residential space and this much retail space. Well, you can write algorithms that use massive data sets that can basically churn out a whole bunch of iterations of that building for you. So I think in terms of reducing carbon footprint, it's already affecting design, transportation, electricity grids. So I think, to be honest, there are probably too many avenues. I thought about this a little bit. I think there are too many avenues to even think about, but they're all over the place and they're just going to grow exponentially in the next few years.
But it's rich with potential.
Oh, yeah, crazy potential. Like I was talking to my dad about this actually a couple of weeks ago, saying there's so much data in the world now, and there aren't enough people who know how to crunch that data and how to extract meaningful information and conclusions from it. So the way I see it, data is like the new oil, and there aren't enough miners. Definitely tons of potential.
That's actually a good segue to this question. How are you now focusing your consulting and future software development efforts on dealing with the important challenges of the 21st century imperative? And specifically, I'm thinking how we deal with significantly reducing the environmental harm, and we've been talking a bit about that, how we deal with environmental repair and regeneration, and how we deal with climate change adaptation. Where are you going in that realm with your own consulting?
Well, I really love the software space, and I also truly believe that the main piece that's been missing, or actually there's no panacea, but like one of the main pieces that's been missing is the ability to put a dollar value on this stuff. So that's what I'm continuing to do, working with people like Bob Willard, for example, on making new tools, just essentially to get this capability in the hands of more people so that, more people understand that this exists. And it's about education and enabling people to understand that this capacity exists and to reframe the conversation as much as anything. So that's kind of what I'm focused on. And specifically around those three things, how to reduce environmental harm, repairing, and adaptation. I would say the main two things that I've been focused on are reducing environmental harm and adaptation, because a lot of these decisions, especially in the context of building, for the foreseeable future at least, there's going to be some environmental harm from, say, putting up a 40-story skyscraper, 40-story building. And so
in terms of its carbon footprint for the materials as well
air
as
pollution and all that kind of, like, everything. And so a lot of what I've been focused on, and probably will continue to be, is around how to minimize the environmental harm while optimizing for the outcomes that the building owner wants. And similarly with adaptation, that's around the term resiliency, right? And that's a big buzzword now as well. How do we increase the resiliency of our built environment and increase the resiliency of the markets to climate risks? And so I think that's a huge one as well.
And to do that, some quantification is going to be necessary.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
That's where you're going.
Yeah.
More generally speaking, what do you think are the most promising policies and strategies, or technologies even, for helping us reduce the environmental harm we are now causing and repair the damage? Like, are there things that you would say these are 2 or 3 key policies that government should be looking at, or strategies that the private sector should be looking at? What stand out for you?
My first immediate answer to that is there's some really fun technology. Like, I'm a huge fan of Tesla. I know that's a little bit cliche, but I'm like a massive fan of Tesla. I think it's really cool. So I love their cars, and they just last week announced the roof shingles, the solar panel
those are
ones
amazing. Yeah.
that are officially cheaper than regular shingles and have an
will last
infinity
forever.
warranty. Like,
I love that.
He's so good at marketing, and it's so funny.
With the
What's the warranty?
infinity symbol
Infinity.
on top. That's right.
Yeah. But to be honest with you, I think that the way that I think of it, if climate change were a beast, it's going to be death by 1,000 cuts. There is no one thing that will destroy it, unfortunately, and that is unfortunate because everybody wants there to be that one silver bullet, but it just doesn't really exist, I don't think. One piece of technology that I personally think is going to explode in the next decade, but there needs to be a lot more research in it, is what's called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And some of the listeners, or maybe even a lot of them, have heard of that already. But I think that that's a pretty interesting avenue where essentially you use plants essentially to sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Then you burn the plants and you produce energy from that. And then you capture the carbon from the burning of that vegetation, and you pump it down into the earth, into old oil wells and stuff like that.
Or there's another really cool version, Pond Technologies, who we'll be interviewing later in this podcast, are taking algae and using it to sequester or metabolize CO2 from emissions, and
Yep.
then using the algae either as a biomass to burn again, so it internalizes the CO2 so it doesn't escape, or using the algae to remediate
Yeah.
like mining sites and
Yeah, I checked them out yesterday, actually.
very, very cool.
Yeah, they have really cool technology. I agree. Even pond, though. Pond is a type of bioenergy.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of
It's carbon capture in the
Yeah.
algae.
Yeah.
And then you can use that algae as biomass.
Yes, they're just missing the storage component.
Yeah. Actually, you can dry it and store it infinitely
Yeah, that's true.
without having put in big wells. But that's another story.
Well, it's pretty interesting, but I think that technology is really cool, and I think it's going to be a requirement in order for us to meet our targets. So, referring back to that article that I talked about a little bit earlier, the roadmap for rapid decarbonization, they talk about the necessity of improving that technology and applying it in the next 10 years, basically. And the targets they actually set in that study were that we should be sequestering about 500 million tons of carbon dioxide per year by the year 2030 with bioenergy and CCS, 2.5 billion tons by 2040, and then 5 billion tons by 2050. So to put that into perspective, we currently emit 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. So in other words, this is saying that by the year 2050, which really isn't that far away, this kind of technology or some form of carbon capture and storage should be sequestering about 15% of our current emissions, which is a massive, massive amount. And that's going to be required, I think, in order to meet our carbon reduction targets. So anyway, I think that's not being spoken about enough yet, but I think that's going to be a pretty interesting technology in the next 10 years.
So you made the great analogy, if climate change is a beast, then it's going to be death by a million small cuts. So what do you think the best way is to drive large-scale change and large-scale action?
I think the main thing is ensuring that there's widespread understanding of the problem and the solutions. This isn't a scientific problem anymore. I truly believe this is a socioeconomic problem.
Yes, very much so.
And it's not, and I don't think it's a socioeconomic problem because it's going to be bad for economies to adapt. I think we just need enough public support to put the regulatory standards in place to drive this forward so the market can drive this forward. I truly think it's mostly about public support. If all of Canada or all of the United States all of a sudden turned around and said, we think climate change is a huge threat and we want our government to do something about it, they would do it like that, like immediately. So the means is there, the technical capacity is there. We just need to get everyone understanding the problem and thinking about climate change risks in decisions on a regular basis.
And your role is to provide them with the tools to quantify it so that the decisions can be made and quantified. So you can know when you say we have to reduce X number of 1,000 or 100,000 tons of carbon, then how do you do it? Quantify it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or that's what I hope my role is.
Who are some of the thinkers on sustainability and future proofing that you admire?
I really love the new head of the EPA and Donald Trump. No, I'm just kidding. But seriously, I don't know if I have a really great answer to this question, but aside from saying people like Elon Musk or Obama or Angela Merkel, just because those are people who had a vision and were in a position or put themselves in a position to implement real change and are doing it or have done it. So like I look at Germany as an example, and what I was just saying in that last question about where there's a will, there's a way. Looking at Germany, the Germans have had in the scheme of things, relatively widespread support for climate change reducing initiatives and greening of their economy for years. So renewable energy, for example, constituted 6.3% of German energy production in the year 2000. And last year it was up over 34%. So they've gone up almost 6 times, they've multiplied almost by 6 times their renewable energy production in that 16-year period, even though it wasn't even cost effective at the time. They had massive, massive subsidies going into it, but it was just because the people wanted it. And now we can make the business case for it, at least on a much more regular basis. So I think that that just kind of drives the point home that if there is widespread public support for something, then it can be done. But you need to have leaders who also believe in it, like Angela Merkel and Barack Obama. And Elon Musk, I just think is really cool.
Whose ideas do you find problematic?
Well, it would be easy to say Donald Trump, but to be honest, I would say any climate deniers. And there are many more than I think there should be, which is basically zero. But they're so loud in what they believe. And I think it's a big problem. I know for those of you who know Bill Nye, you might have seen this segment where he went on CNN and talked about one of the problems was actually the fact that he was part of a climate change debate on CNN with one other individual who had an opposing view and saying, like, this is ridiculous because it's not actually 50-50.
Right. It's 1 to 99.
Yeah, exactly. It's 1 to 99. But the problem is that there is a general lack of understanding of the science behind climate change. So as a general member of the public who is not trained in biology or any science or even potentially economics, it's confusing to listen to one person who says one thing and one person who says another thing. I mean, no wonder there's so many people who don't really know if climate change is a real problem or not, or kind of think that it is, but can be convinced that inaction is okay because there are still loud voices saying that it's not true. So anybody who's a climate denier is the biggest problem because it's creating confusion and it's just stirring up a lack of scientific understanding.
And this is a huge problem because even as we develop the tools, the technology for addressing carbon, we still have a fairly sizable percentage of the public that doesn't buy into it. I mean, it's somewhere around like 20%, isn't it?
I don't know the number, but it's pretty high.
But it's significant, depending on how you account for it.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Are we going to be able to pull back from the brink of environmental disaster as a species when we have a significant portion of our species actually not buying into it? I mean, this is a sort of all hands on deck problem.
Yeah.
And if you can't get that buy-in, it's going to be very difficult. What do you think? Are we going to be able to do this? I mean, you're developing the tools in a very positive, proactive way, but are we going to be able to pull this thing off?
Well, I don't know, obviously, but I like to be optimistic and think that we will. It would be pretty dark if I was working in this industry and thought that we were just doomed.
Yeah.
But
fair enough.
I think that I truly believe that where there's a will, there's a way. And we have the technology, we have the capacity to make these changes. We honestly just have to do it. Again, that article really kind of gave me a little bit of hope in the sense that at least there's some sort of path that still exists where we can move towards decarbonizing our atmosphere enough that we avoid catastrophe, essentially. There's one other thing I want to mention. So when I was in undergrad in third year, I took this course it was probably one of the top 2 most interesting courses that I took in undergrad at Queen's University. And it was called The Evolutionary Ecology of Humans. And I loved it because it was talking about the major problems that we faced as humanity in the next 50 years. And I'm going to try and do this off the top of my head, but I think they were climate change, water shortage, food shortage, peak oil, overpopulation, and
resistance to
superbugs.
Superbugs.
Yeah, exactly. So those were the 6 main problems. And it was really interesting because the course was divided up. And by the way, the book for the course was Guns, Germs, and Steel, which also is a really good book. But the course was divided up into 6 sections with each section dedicated to one of those problems. And so each section would start off and say what the problem was. And then the next part of the section would say what the solution to the problem was. And then the third part would say why we weren't going to solve the problem because of X, Y, and Z examples in history and how humans behave. So it was like a roller coaster of emotions for a course. You'd leave the first part of each section being like, wow, this is crazy. How are we going to solve it? Second part feeling super optimistic, and the third part feeling super depressed. And so the way that I ended up not feeling super depressed at the end of that course, oh, and I should say that was one of the reasons that I decided to go to climate change as well. Those were the 6 main problems, and I was totally on board with that. And I thought, well, that would be an interesting one to try to tackle or be a part of tackling. But
An important course then.
it was a really good, very important course for me. But the thing that stopped me from feeling pessimistic at the end of that course was thinking about the numbers around the number of people that are working on each of those problems. So we've got 7 billion people on the planet now. And I remember just thinking to myself, okay, 7 billion people, and we've got these 6 main problems. Let's just say conservatively that there's like 100,000 people, which is a very small number in the scheme of things, working on each of these problems. So there's like, just over 500,000 people working on these problems. Okay, let's say like we take the top 1 percentile of those 100,000 in each group that are like the brightest people working on these problems. That's still 1,000 people working on each of these problems around the world. And I'm like, you know what? Like 1,000 of the brightest of the world's brightest, and then you've got 99,000 other people. And of course, those numbers are super low. I'm sure it's in like the millions or tens of millions or even higher than that, depending on the problem, like climate change. So that kind of gives me hope, is that there are so many people working on these problems, putting their lives, their careers behind solving these problems. And so that's kind of that keeps me optimistic.
It reminds me of what the former president of the Czech Republic and poet, the late Václav Havel, once asked. He said, "Isn't it the moment of most profound doubt that gives birth to new certainties? Perhaps hopelessness is the very soil that nourishes human hope." And you talked about your hope. What, given our global environmental predicament, what things nourish your hope?
In addition to what I just mentioned about the number of people working on climate change, trying to solve the problem, I would say the views of the younger generation also give me hope. So there's a lot of, what's the next generation? Gen Z? Is that
I think so.
Generation Z people?
Oh, the millennials are pretty young right now too.
Yeah, I know. So the millennials give me hope too. But I would say both of those, millennials, Gen Y and Gen Z, there is so, like, we all recognize that this is our problem.
Yeah, well, the boomers, my generation, have stuck you guys with these problems. It's pretty brutal.
Yeah. So I mean, the buy-in and the understanding, I think, is going to skyrocket as, I mean, the millennials are already in the workforce, but as Gen Z also starts entering the workforce. So I would say that gives me some hope as well. It's, we need more people who truly believe in this problem, or I shouldn't use the word believe, understand the problem, and are willing to make what I would consider to be the right decisions to get on track towards fixing it in a big way. And those two generations, I think, are going to be in positions to do that.
What do you think is missing from the discussion of climate change? Are there any other questions or better questions we should be asking ourselves?
Well, as I mentioned, and as we all know, it's a complex problem. And I think one of the things that makes it especially challenging is that because it's a future projection, for the most part, there is such a broad range of the severity of outcomes. So we know that the climate is changing. We know that there's going to be increased flooding and prevalence of drought and all kinds of negative things. But the range around that and what areas are going to be affected is so broad that I think the uncertainty is the scary part. And it's particularly unsettling to think about the human component. So the UN Refugee Agency warns that approximately 250
50 million
people
would be climate refugees.
Would be climate refugees by the year 2050. And nobody would say that it's inaccurate to say that that's more or less a shot in the dark. Like, it's 250 million minimum. Like, it could be way higher than that.
Yeah, and given how the UN works, it's probably underestimated.
Right. So what's going to happen to all those people? So I think that there's going to be pretty massive human crises in the next few decades. And I'm sure there are really smart people working on this and thinking about it. But I think that should be part of the conversation to make it more tangible. It's not just that my parents' backyard is going to have an inch more rain in 10 years or 20 years. Like, there's a massive human component on an international scale to this. And I think that that should be part of the conversation more often as well.
What advice would you offer listeners about what they can do to be part of making a difference in meeting the challenges of the 21st century imperative?
So I think I want to reiterate one thing I said earlier, which is that this isn't a scientific problem, it's a socioeconomic problem. And so I could say kind of common things like eat less red meat and use less energy. But I think the biggest thing that we could all do is, actually, I have kind of four main suggestions. So my friends make fun of me because I always list things when I'm talking. But
that's a good thing to do. I like listing things too.
Yeah.
And things you can
Helps
count
me
on your
structure my
fingers.
thoughts.
Up
Yeah.
to 5.
So I would say number one is, and if you're listening to this podcast, you're already doing this, but try to spread it, I guess, is educate yourself in the things that you don't know. So if you're an economist or you're into finance or accounting or whatever, then, if you're interested, learn some of the science around this, because I mean, it's pretty interesting. If you're a science person, learn some of the economic side, because I think one of the major problems in addressing climate change is that there is this divide between those two areas of expertise, and there isn't enough overlap. There aren't enough scientists thinking about the economics, and there aren't enough economists thinking about the science. You've got the two groups that are kind of trying to talk to each other. But I think the more that we have a common understanding of those two areas, I think the better off we'll be. And to be honest, I think it's really interesting. Both areas are pretty interesting. The second thing I would say is to spread that understanding. And I would say that's maybe even more important because, again, if you're listening to this, you already are on board and you basically understand the problem. So I would say that the second thing, which is maybe the most important, is to spread that understanding, because we can't have whatever it is, 30% or 20% of the public not understanding the problem of climate change. And I know this is already becoming more of a common conversation topic, but it needs to be like front and center. Like, we're out of time in terms of when we can make major changes. It's kind of now. So spreading that understanding. The third thing, this might be a little bit of a cliche one as well, but make your voice heard by politicians and vote, because we need the government. I mean, I'm a huge believer that the private sector can drive massive change, but there is a place for regulation and subsidies and government intervention here to help drive those market changes so that they can happen at a greater scale and much faster. So number 3 is to vote and make your voice heard by politicians. And then number 4, my last one, is that there is no panacea to this. There is no silver bullet for climate change. And there's a bit of a game theory issue with climate change. This is like the biggest tragedy of the commons that we've ever seen. There are so many people, organizations, or countries that can find examples of other people or organizations or countries that aren't doing anything. And they kind of go, well, if they're not doing anything, then I don't really have to do anything. But because there is no silver bullet here, because the climate change beast is death by 1,000 cuts, my fourth thing would be find your cut, find your way to make a difference. And it can be anything. It could be eating less red meat or using less energy. It could be spreading the word. It could be dozens of things. Whatever it is that in your life you can do to contribute, I would say that can be your little cut to the beast. So those would be my 4 things.
Those are excellent. And I think all things that people could see themselves doing right now. Let's shift gears a bit. I'd like to ask you a few hypothetical questions to wrap up our conversation.
Okay.
First of all, what would you teach a grade 9 class if you were going to be a guest teacher to help them better understand how to create a more sustainable, regenerative world?
So I don't know that I would teach them any specific thing to help them make a more regenerative world. I actually, just quick sidebar, I actually went to a movie premiere for a movie about Bill Nye, the science guy,
Right.
last week.
Yeah.
I know I mentioned him once earlier in this podcast already, but
That's okay. He's worthy of being mentioned multiple times.
yeah. So I guess he's top of mind for me.
Yeah.
But I actually met him in person last week, which was really cool. Like I used to watch him all the time as a kid, so I was pretty excited to meet Bill Nye. But
Bill Nye, the science guy.
yeah. But he's on a mission right now to spread awareness about climate change and the importance of science and understanding and getting passionate about science. And I've always loved science. Like I was, Santa Claus would get me a chemistry kit when I was in like grade 3, and I was super excited about that. So I've always loved science, but I feel like, and I could be wrong on this, but from what I understand, it seems like there's almost been a bit of backtracking in terms of interest in science in the last few years in schools, at least in some areas of North America. And so I think that everyone needs to get charged about science again. So I guess if I was talking to a grade 9 class, I might even show them a Bill Nye video, but just do my best to get people excited about science because it's such a cool thing. It's all about how the world works. And I think that if you start down a path of loving and respecting science, then it's almost inevitable that you understand the importance of changing the way that we do things to reduce the effects of climate change and understanding climate change. I think it's all interrelated. So I guess the theme of my message here is it's about understanding and appreciation of science.
Science is cool.
Science rules.
If you could actually get the United Nations to agree on and then implement any policy or set of policies of your making, what would they be?
Okay, that's a good question. I would probably say agreeing on some sort of a global carbon pricing scheme. I think that would be the single largest impact on a global basis. The argument that you hear time and time again against making changes to make a more sustainable built environment or society or economy actually is that it's going to damage the economy. And again, you have this massive game theory component to climate change where people don't want to be first movers. And it doesn't matter what scale you're at because they feel like they're going to be the loser in the game if they're paying more upfront to adapt to new technologies. So, and again, sometimes it is already beneficial to implement greener technologies. You can make the business case for it, but in a lot of cases you can't. So I would say if the UN could implement a carbon pricing scheme, whatever that would be, that was commonly adopted across the world, then that would be really cool. But I know that's impossible, but that would be my answer to the question.
That makes a lot of sense. And final hypothetical question. If you were given a full page spread in the Sunday New York Times to publish any graphic or written material you wanted, what would you do with it?
So I would probably turn that question around or tweak it just a little bit and say, I would like to put a full page spread in the Financial Times rather than the New York Times. And my reason for that is because I would want my message to be financially oriented and I would want to target, investors because I would want to communicate a message that kind of says how they're going to be affected by climate change. And what I would probably put is I wouldn't fill it up with tons of tables or graphs or paragraphs or anything like that. I would want to keep it simple. So I would have pretty well the whole page blank, except for in the middle, I might have 2 sentences. One would say the deficit of the United States government last year was $500 billion. the social cost of carbon pertaining to the carbon emitted by the United States last year was $500 billion. And so, really driving home the point that we're all talking about wanting balanced budgets so that we don't put ourselves in a precarious position in the coming years. Well, climate change is exactly the same thing, and it can be quantified in dollar terms, and it's an equal size to the entire U.S. government deficit. So, pretty big problem.
I think that would have a significant impact because it really does focus on that financial piece of it, which sometimes just doesn't get talked about.
Yep.
Finally, to wrap up, is there anything you would like to ask of our listeners?
I guess the only thing I would ask is kind of nutshelling those 4 points I said earlier about what I think everyone can do, which is to help spread the understanding of the problem of climate change and also get people thinking about the solutions to climate change and what can everyone's contribution or everyone's one cut be, to continue with the analogy I was using earlier, to help slay the beast of climate change. So we need to move everybody past the question of, is this happening? And move more towards how can we solve it and how can we all solve it as individuals and as groups and companies and countries. And I was looking at some of these facts as I was kind of taking notes for this talk and trying to put my thoughts together around, we're using practically 2 Earths worth of resources per year now. And, sea levels are rising and there's, this amount of increase in flood risk in the coming decades. But I actually think about something that one of my colleagues from Impact Infrastructure told me a week ago, which is you don't motivate a sports team with negativity. You don't take a football team at halftime and say, okay, guys, we're down by 3 goals. Now get out there and you guys better score some goals. Otherwise, we're going to lose this game and it's going to be really bad. Like, that's not how you motivate people. So when you guys as listeners are talking to other people, there has to be a balance that's struck between being real and making sure that everybody understands the problem. But also, this is our generation's and our life's problem. This is the problem of our time. And the truth is there aren't going to be a key 1,000 people that solve this problem. Everyone needs to contribute to it. And so I get kind of excited when I flip it on its head and say, we will solve this problem. I believe we will solve this problem, but it will only happen if everybody contributes. But I believe that will happen, but you guys need to do it. And everybody needs to step up and grab the bull by the horns, and hopefully we'll solve it.
That's a very smart ask, Ryan. Thank you. And I think that's a great place to wrap up this conversation today. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you.
To be part of this.
It was a lot of fun.
It's been a lot of fun. And I think given all of the things that you're going to be doing now, that we're going to have to get you back in the not too distant future for another session.
That would be great.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You can find links to more information about Ryan Meyers and to notes about what we discussed in this podcast at tfcipodcast.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.